Hello, welcome to episode 163 of the Book Binge for a very experimental episode. This week we're going to be doing a discussion of sorts about the infinite TBR, as some like to consider it, or what I'm considering the fractal that is the TBR, or any other to-do list that you could imagine, whether that be a reading list, or a watch list, or a games to play list, or any form of list, a bucket list of just things to do, things that lists that just continue to expand on and on, seemingly into eternity, with basically wanton disregard for your desires otherwise. This is a goofy concept for video, I confess, and in many ways I think it would be a little bit better scripted in a scripted format, a video essay type of thing, but I'm not really into doing that with book content on this channel. I may do a more polished and in-depth version talking in other forms of media and including other examples other than just books, maybe someday in the future, who knows, but bear with me for a different kind of video this time around about the complications that is the TBR. So let's start off with a definition of terms. What is the TBR? Well, I think most of us know this just kind of implicitly if you happen to be around the booktube space a lot, but the TBR is the to-be-read pile, a never-ending, ever-growing metaphorical, and literal for some of us, stack of books, or any other media form that we want to eventually read or tackle if it's movies or games or whatever have you. The TBR is also a different thing to different people. We have a general understanding of what it is at its basis, but some of us have different ideas of what it is more specifically. To some, the TBR is a hard set schedule to keep on track. To others, it's a vague set of books that just mean, someday I'll get around to this. To some, the TBR is the list of books you own, with more to buy on the horizon. I fall into sort of this sphere, like any book that I buy, I basically have some intent of reading someday, if vaguely. To others, it's the entire list of things that you mark to read on Goodreads or similar platforms. I know not everybody buys all of the books that they put on their to-read pile in Goodreads. I personally only put the books that I buy into my to-read pile on Goodreads to help keep track of stuff. It's a little bit easier for my brain that way, for example. To some, the TBR is a form of object, metaphorically speaking. To others, it is simply an idea. It is a thing that kind of exists, but we don't really use it much. Different people, you use the TBR to different degrees. I believe I covered this relatively recently, maybe it was a while ago, I don't entirely remember, when I discussed the general habits that some people have when it comes to reading or planning their reading. How many people have a hard set schedule that follow that and don't really stray from it very much, versus a scale going all the way up to people who do not plan at all, because when they do, they find it themselves unable to read the book that they planned because they're just not really in the mood for it. I think I've discussed this before, so just as different people have different ways of planning their reading, different people have different ideas of what the TBR is in accordance to this planning style, we'll say. But what affects the general TBR? So let's consider the more general list of books to read someday, trademark, the general TBR, the kind of middle of the road pack, people who have a list of books that they would like to read, but it's not really that serious, and maybe they adhere themselves to it, maybe they don't, but this is just kind of, the base definition of what I'm going to call the general TBR. Similar to how wide the variety in what the TBR is, what adds to it also changes for people as well. Sometimes a cool cover is enough to add a book to the TBR. Sometimes it's the author, if it's a favorite or a palate cleanser type of idea. Sometimes it's recommendations from friends or YouTube channels or other similar means. When a book gets high praises from people that you respect, you might do that. Sometimes it's the general hype throughout various different groups, even if nobody specifically, maybe if you don't have a specific reason to add a book to your TBR, maybe just the fact that most of the people you know who have read it really like it is good enough reason to add it. But sometimes as well, books come off the TBR or just simply never interest you. So maybe why are some of the reasons for this? Well, I think maybe again, The covers of some authors involved can cause books to maybe not be super interesting to certain readers. Maybe it's recommendations or hype from people you just inherently don't trust. Maybe it's learning something about the ideals of the book or author that turn you off to some degree. Maybe it's as simple as, I don't really want to read that, and you don't really have a reason why. There are people I know in all of these groups. For me personally, I have some friends who I generally trust with recommendations whenever they give me something to check out or give me a recommendation of something to read at some point. I'll generally take it seriously. There are other people, if they give me a recommendation of a book, I will kind of just hold it by the very tip of the corner and kind of keep it out of my vicinity because I don't really trust their tastes. There are other people who, you kind of have to adjust your expectations based off of how your appeals coincide with theirs. If you may not agree very much with certain books, if they recommend a book to broad audiences, but you know that you tend to disagree, maybe you'll avoid that book. Maybe sometimes if somebody really dislikes a book, but maybe you like books that person tends to dislike, so you add it to your DBR discreetly. All kinds of things can affect the way we add or take off books from this general TBR pile. But how does this translate to a more direct TBR? Let's consider the actual schedule or plans, whether loose or dense, the direct TBR. So for people like me, this would be you have X amount of books that you plan to read in the month, and you're basically going to read those books. Maybe one gets pushed back, maybe you throw something in there randomly, but for the most part, you have a schedule, and that's mostly what you're sticking to. For other people, you may have something a little bit more loose, you have an idea of books that you're interested in, and you'll just pick one up when you're ready for one. I think either one of these paths does still work for a direct TBR definition. But I think the combination of factors in how people decide to read what they read is vast, and I think this is pretty clear. If you talk to anybody about what their influence in picking up a certain book is, there's going to be a wide swath of reasons that maybe even you didn't consider when it comes to certain books that you choose to read. It's almost impossible to weigh all of the options. That said, for me, I have a few different ways of doing my planning. I also covered this in a past video to an extent a couple years ago at this point. I actually don't know when. It might have been right around a year and a half ago. I don't remember when this video is coming out off the top of my head, so probably, let's say around a year and a half ago, I did a video that was approximately titled How I Plan My TBR or How I Schedule My Reading, something along those lines, and in there I talked a little bit more in detail, though that has shifted slightly since then. Some of my direct TBR comes from read-alongs and buddy reads, some of it comes from hype from friends. A little of it comes from widespread community hype, some comes from direct recommendations, some comes from what I want to read as a palate cleanser, some of it comes from work projects, often proofreads or copy edits for Sun Eater in this case. And all of these things have their own place in my TBR that I kind of switch between on any given month based on my mood or based on what else is going on. Primarily with read-alongs and buddy reads and stuff, those generally come first because they have a general set date that they're supposed to happen in, and then I throw in my other primary reads in the midst of those. Big books I tend to schedule a long time in advance because, well, they're big and I want to make sure that I have enough time to read them. And then I let palate cleansers and short books fill in gaps. These are I'm a little bit more loose with in terms of scheduling. Sometimes I'll see a book that's a little bit shorter and I'll be like, I kind of feel like reading that. I have a space approximately in this time of the month where I don't really have any major reading plans going on there. I'll just go ahead and read it then. And that's how I tend to plan a lot of stuff. But all of this has been so far about the TBR. What about the MBR? Well, even beyond the direct TBR, some people include an MBR, which is a maybe read. I don't do these in my videos, or actually sometimes I do in my monthly reading wrap-up and TBR videos. I have a if I have time section, which I guess technically counts as a maybe read section. Some people directly do TBR and MBR videos. There's not a whole lot that goes into this for me, and there's generally a little bit less that goes into an MBR than a TBR because a lot of the reasons that influence us is the same with both lists. One of them just happens to be a if I have extra time to read extra books, these are what I'm looking at kind of thing. But other times when an MBR might be used is as kind of an example that I gave earlier, a list of books that you may fill in certain gaps that you have in the direct TBR if there are gaps. It's like, okay, well, I have this backlist of books that I kind of want to read. What am I going to do with them? Kind of pick one and fit it into the gap a little bit. A list of books to complete the month if everything else gets done. This might also be the case for me sometimes if I know I'm going to have an extra week at the end of a month and I don't have any extra reads planned. I'll go ahead and maybe start one of my next book or next month books early, or sometimes I'll fit something a little bit shorter in between just to kind of fill that space. Maybe even some people have backup lists in case direct TBRs don't go too well. Like, for example, certain series don't work for people, some certain books don't work for people. Some people are very willing to DNF books, so if they have a list of books that they just kind of have on the back burner just in case, it's easier to fill in the gaps if you happen to drop a book or drop the rest of a series if you plan to read a lot in 1 month or in subsequent months. You can kind of fill in gaps there. It doesn't have to be a 1 month thing. I only recently realized, kind of as I hinted at before, that I technically have an MBR list after finding the concept a little bit weird when other people covered them in videos, but it is because I have an if I have time section in my TBR videos. Whenever I'm talking about the books that I plan to read, I have the ones that are like, these are pretty set in stone, maybe I won't get to all of them, but these are the ones that I'm definitely going to try to read this month. And then I have a couple books that I would like to read this month, but I probably won't have time for, kind of idea. So overall, on balance, how does my TBR generally look? Well, I basically already covered this, but I do have an old episode covering this in more detail, as I mentioned. So if you want to check that out for a little bit more detail, you can absolutely do that. But here we come to the age-old question. Is it even possible to manage the TBR or any similar type of to-do list? Well, sort of. It kind of depends on who you are. The vague idea of a TBR is impossible to manage because, well, if you're somebody who just marks any book that sounds mildly interesting as to read on Goodreads, well, you might have a genuinely unmanageable TBR. If you're somebody like me who, well, a couple years ago, I definitely was not restricting the amount of books that I bought, and recently this year I've not really been doing a good job on that either, but generally speaking, I try to limit the amount of books that I purchase, and I only purchase books that I'm seriously considering reading to some degree. So I think people who fall in this kind of list may still have a pretty long list that may or may not be manageable or not, but usually it's a little bit easier to manage if you have a shorter list. Somebody with only 200 or 300 books on their TBR might be a little bit, it might be in shallower water than, say, my friend Patrick, who has maybe like 3,000 or so books on his TBR because he just like buys all of the Kindle sales. So he has just thousands of books on his Kindle. That's a little bit unmanageable in my view. All of that said, for me personally, I think one of the ways that I feel encouraged when it comes to my TBR is managing it in small spurts, getting a couple of months broadly planned out, like having an idea of what you plan to read for a few months, and then getting through some of those months and being able to tack off like 10 or 15 or 20 books, depending on how fast you read. I'm a very slow reader, so I might get, maybe 5 books read in a month. There are plenty of people who read like 10 or 15 books in a month, so those people can definitely get through their TBR a little easier than me, but I think that managing it in small bursts like this, planning a little ahead, and then getting through those books always feels nice. No matter how impossible it is to account for everything, it feels nice in the short term, at the very least. But I want to know how some of you attempt to manage your never-ending TBR, as I have described it at the top of the video. Do you just add and add and add with wanton abandon? Do you try to keep a small list, or like say what you own, kind of like I do? Do you schedule things to help you push through and cross things off? Or do you just kind of YOLO everything? I am curious to know. The conclusion of this video is, in short, the idea of the TBR is kind of fascinating. The TBR is a fractal. When you realize how it is for different people, certain fractals are a little bit more zoomed in with a little bit more edges that you see, and some are a little bit more zoomed out where you're not quite sure where the infinity begins and where it ends. For some people, it's not quite as fractal-like. You can see mostly where the edges begin and end. For other people, it's you don't know where infinity begins or ends, and that's kind of terrifying to think about. But the way it expands, ebbing and flowing in patterns, lends kind of a false sense of security to some people, but also lends a genuine sense of security to others like me. If only there were enough time to get to all of it, whether books or movies or games or whatever else you enjoy doing and consuming as, a fan of media and entertainment. There are too many books, too many movies, too many games, not enough time. How do you try to manage it? So that was certainly a video. Hope it wasn't too rough, and I hope you enjoyed watching it. I'll be back sometime soonish, I believe next Tuesday actually, speaking of TBR videos, with my June reading wrap-up and July TBR video. So if you're interested in checking that out, you can absolutely do so if you stick around. But thank you for watching regardless. I'll be back in the next video.